So tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you girls how I move from study to, say, an essay or an extended response. So what I'm going to do is and I'd like you girls to take this down. What I'm going to do is give you a question that, say, you might see in the HSC in an unseen section. Something like this. Examine how effectively Alice Munro invites the reader into the world of her short story. Your response should draw on your knowledge and understanding of the module literary worlds. Now, we've talked a little bit about literary worlds and what that means, and that basically what we've got when you're asked to examine literary worlds, what you have to do is you have to examine what forms and features an author will use to invite you to suspend disbelief. You remember us talking about suspending disbelief. So basically what you have to do is you have to analyze a text, and you have to be able to talk about two things. You have to be able to talk about the text's purpose or the overall effect, and you have to talk about how a writer gets there. So what I did is I spent some time, and I would actually like you to do a similar thing when we study, and I went through this the other day, is to generate, say, a thesis, and this is my thesis. And that thesis will move as you study a text, but I'd also like you to develop a table where you've got your quotes down here, your techniques here, and your effects here. Now, what I've done, because it's a short story, is I basically collected them together. What I did was I had a look at free radicals and the food and how that kind of develops into an overall or a structural metaphor. And then I did a little bit of thinking about what that represented. Then I had to think about the Gothic genre and how that's established, and I had to think about metafiction. Now, that's not everything, but it's a pretty good start. And as I was thinking, I sort of thought to myself, so those techniques basically, and I did this to help me, basically these are the kinds of techniques that I'm going to be talking about. And then I gave myself a little bit of time to think about how I might write that. And what that does is it means that I can, because I've written these sentences, I'm set up to write something a little bit richer when I'm writing my essay. Okay, so that's the study I've done beforehand, and I actually think this is a really good practice, particularly those of you who are struggling with expression. What this column allows you to do is it gives you time to develop really beautiful sentences that you can use if you want to. So I'm going to answer this question here, and what I want you to do is to listen as I write, so you can see the way that I'm putting this together. Now, what I have to do first of all is I have to articulate what I think the purpose of the text is. Before I start talking about the how, I've got to talk about the why. So you can see over here what I've done is I've developed, this is basically what I think is that she's using the structural metaphor to suggest the power of stories to create literary worlds. So I'm going to develop for myself a little bit of an intro based on that. Okay, so here we go. Alice Munro's story, Free Radicals. Now, I know that it was, this might be in an HSC exam. They might give you where it was published or they might not, but we happen to know this was in the New Yorker. So let's say that. And now I'm going to go into my thesis. Okay, Now, what I've done here that you probably won't be ready for, but will be in a year, this bit here, I'm actually drawing from the rubric, which talks about how literary worlds respond to context. But what I've said here is, yes, they respond to context, but they also make context. So that's what I've done there. I'm just drawing from the rubric, basically. Okay. All right, next I think I'm actually going to go with what I think Monroe's saying about this. All right, so here I've set myself up because I think, you know me by now, is I actually think the most interesting thing about this story is the metafictive qualities of it. So I've left myself room to do that. Oopsie, spell SGS. Okay, now I just have to explain what I've done here. So I've used Coleridge's, and we talked about this in class. I didn't say that was Coleridge. I could do that. Let's change that. There we go. But what I've done, what I wanted to draw attention to, was I've drawn a distinction between the imaginary world and the material world. So what that's basically the fictional world and the real world. I've just given them different names. Okay, now I'm just going to go back and see if my thesis is clear here. Yeah, that there is actually clearer than anything I've said. So I'm going to lift it right out of my thesis and I'm going to put it on the end there. Okay, so now I've got basically an intro for myself, and you guys will be doing this under exam conditions eventually, but it does help to just do this over and over again so that when you put under pressure, you can do it standing, standing on the point of a pin. But what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to write about the easiest thing to write about. I actually think metafiction is a really hard thing to write about, so I'm going to make the decision to write about it last. Oftentimes, your best point is your last point, and oftentimes you've got to set up the boring stuff to demonstrate to your marker that you know how to work with language. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the easiest thing, which is to explain that the story is interesting because it is a Gothic story. Now, you all know how to do that. So what I'm going to do is write a topic sentence about that. Okay, so this one, I've mentioned the Gothic genre, but I also talked about the effect on us as readers, right? This is how we're invited into the literary worlds. So now what I have to do is I have to show how Monroe indicates it to us that she is using the Gothic genre. So I've got all of that over here because I've done there we go. I'm going to talk about the train tracks, the cellar, the invader, and maybe I'll get to the weapons. But if I can't write about all of that, but basically if I choose something here, I can pretty well demonstrate, and here I've written some sentences, I can pretty well demonstrate that this is what makes the story exciting, okay? Invites us into this literary world, makes it it invites us, I suppose, to suspend disbelief. Okay, so I'm just going to write basically a list or a map of the way that I'm going to work through the text. Okay, now what I've done here is, okay, so I've introduced this idea of an archetypal symbol of the genre, and you can see that I've done that over here, right? So I've got those already, right? Or Gothic conventions, I could have said. But what I've done is to help me to structure what I'm going to say, I just listed the things that are the archetypal symbols, and now I'll just work through them one by one and do my QTEs, right? So let's do the seller first. This is the quote. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to go back here. Okay, I'm just going to deal with one quote at a time. So copy, paste. There we go. I don't have to chop it out. All right. Now what I have to do is show that I can analyze that, right? So let's see what I can do with that. All right. So what I've done here is what I keep telling you girls to do. So you plonk down your whole quote, right? The thing that has alerted to us that the fact that it's Gothic. But then I've pulled out the dirt floor and the dirty cobwebs because that's how those to me are the things that signal to me in that sentence, apart from the seller, that she's playing with the Gothic genre. I've said that it's in caricature here because I think that she's hamming it up a bit here before she actually introduces the true Gothic elements with the invader. Okay, so the next thing I have to do is to deal with the basement. So let's do that. Okay, let's go over here. All right, now I'm going to use that bit. Go back over here. All right, so this bit lets me deal with the basement itself, the idea of a menace coming from the basement. Now, just a word on this, you can see that when I am introducing quotations, I say who is talking, so who says what to whom, and I've done it here. These are called orienting clauses, I suppose. And every time you introduce a quotation, you should do that, okay? Because that makes it smooth to read. But anyway, so having got my big quote down, what should I do next? So let's just have a think. I think we need to deal with the basement, right? But I also think this is interesting. This is interesting to me because this bit's funny, but then we need to suggest that this foreshadows, I suppose, what's about to be quite unfunny. So let's talk about that. Okay, I've decided to introduce another quote here because as I thought about it, I thought, okay, the basement and the invader kind of come together as the invader comes from the basement. So I'm going to plonk down a quotation to suggest how she foreshadows the invader as well. And then I'm going to bring them together with a third quote, if that makes any sense. So let's get this through. Hang on, where did I put that? This bit here. Let's do this one. Next. I'm going to put that down. All right, so now I've got the invader and the basement together. Let's bring them together. So this is where it all gets real. You remember this bit. So you can see here you've got the cellar door and then you've got the invader. And so you can sort of suggest how these ones up here are foreshadowing because you've done that. Okay. Now, just for those of you who are like, oh, I've got to mention, you know, my favorites. I've got to mention diction, or I've got to mention accumulation. If you go through here, right, and we do as I've suggested to you, let's make all of the techniques red just for a second. You can see that if you're analysing in a kind of organic way, you mention them anyway. That counts as a technique, I reckon. You could write conventions if you really wanted to. That's a technique. Something that's made a bit sort of funny. There's one. There's one. And so on. There we go. I also want to talk about this this verb here. I'm really struggling with that one because I think this comes from teaching it. This is when the story, I use the word pivot because all of a sudden it starts to get real for the reader. That's when you get interested, is when it becomes real, right? So, okay, what am I going to do now? I think that it's time for me to move on and I need to wrap this up. So I'm actually going to go back to my topic sentence, and I'm going to bring in a concluding sentence that wraps this up and allows me to move on to another way that Munro invites us in. Oh, spelling. Okay, I'm going to change that to conventions just for fun. Okay, so what I've tried to do here is talk about the ways in which I've tried to think about the Gothic genre. The great thing about the Gothic genre is that usually some kind of complication, i.e. the invader, is introduced. And basically the fun of the Gothic genre is the resolution of that tension. Even in horror, it's kind of like, you know, we've all made it go away. So that's why the literary world of the Gothic is interesting. And that's what I've tried to get there. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do, I think, is I'm going to have to tackle this business of the free radicals. So what I'm going to do is do the boring stuff first, which is to get down, rather than what it means, I'm first of all going to prove that there is a pattern of free radicals. So I'm going to write a topic sentence that allows me to do that. Can't spell again. Hate that word, but I'm using it anyway. Titular, so rude. Means title, by the way. All right. So Munro invites us into her complex world by indicating the titular free radicals as a structural metaphor as a key to interpret her world. Basically, what I'm trying to angle out there is I'm trying to prove that these free radicals is the key to unlocking the whole thing. So I probably have to get the what we understood to be the definition down, and then I can play with how that works. You remember this? There we go. All right. So now what I have to do is basically prove that that is a pattern in the characters of the text. So let's have a look here. first plot point. Okay, so I'm just going to grab a boring quote to prove that I'm not making it up. So that makes free radicals a part of the story. Okay, now the most obvious thing to do is to go to the title, right? It's a technique, by the way, the title. Okay, I'm just going to stop there and explain. So I've gone from the title here. I'm going to give that a red. Okay. And that is also another technique there. The main plot point. Plot is a technique. It's probably what's called form. So is motif. All right. So what I've said here is the title indicates that we should follow a pattern, right? Captured in that word motif through the main plot point. Nita has cancer. And what I really wanted to get to was this idea of the healing foods. You remember how we found all these foods that were antioxidants, which are supposed to kind of mitigate against free radicals. So I'm just going to list them, all the ones that we did some research and I did a bit more, and found all of these, pretty much all the foods that are referenced in the story are antioxidants. Hang on. Oh gosh. Okay, so you can see here that I'm using the quotes quite differently to the way I've used them, say, up here when I dumped down a big quotation and then I did sort of like a microscopic examination of them. Here, because I'm wanting to establish that it's a motif, right? That free radicals operates as a motif. I've literally found all of the patterns or the pieces of the pattern and dumped them down in a row. And that essentially proves that this is a motif, if that makes any sense. So next, I probably have to set myself up to say, what is the point of this? There's no point in a motif except that it's cute, right? So I have to get to the purpose of it. So I'm going to write a sentence that lets me get to that. Mentioning the rubric. Now you can see here what I've really tried to do is to go back to what I tried to say up here, right? I'm really talking about the interaction between the literary world and the real world and the ways in which storytelling can help us navigate that gap. So when you're writing, it's really important that, particularly in these concluding bits, you're bringing it back to that topic sentence and you're bringing it back to your original point. Bearing in mind, we've already spoken about the fact that sometimes this here isn't good enough to hold the water of the whole thing, in which case you can write it again. That's fine. Okay, so now that I proved that there's a motif, really what I have to do is I have to talk about what that means, right? So it's fine that there are free radicals in the story. So what? Okay, so I am going to write a topic sentence that suggests what I think all of this means. So I'm going to prove basically that these two characters are character parallels, that they are what the metaphor points to. I lost it. Hang on. Okay, Nita tells us, oh, I know this bit. Yes, we go over here. I can find my quotation. There it is, this one. Okay, and you can see how this quotation proves what I have said here. It causes great damage to the family unit. All right, so now what we have to do, obviously, is to prove this one. So let's find something. Now, I didn't use this one I had over in the Gothic bit there. The train tracks, weeds were lavish, and I didn't use it, and I really like that quote, so I'm going to use it now, just for fun. I've got to find the quote again. Weeds were lavish. I think it's something like that. Now, I've yanked that quote from the end, but basically this wanted for triple murder lets me prove that he's caused great damage. So it lets me prove basically that the two characters are the same. So I should probably say that like that with the big technique, character parallel. All right, now this is finally where I wanted to get to, right? They both tell a story. So first of all, they establish this character parallel. I'm just going to go through again and point out the techniques, okay? All right, now you can see that while here I haven't technically used a technique, the quotations I've given back up what I'm saying here. That counts as a technique, not that I can highlight anything. But, you know, I've shown off a little bit here and brought in the metaphor again, not that I had to. But yeah, you can do that. All right, so now what I really have to do is to bring in because I've established that they're both character parallels, I have to now parallel their stories, okay? So let's do that. Okay, All right, and I think if I want to prove that he intends to terrify her before murdering her, the thing that creeped me out, I'm not sure about you, but was the plate. So I'm going to put that quote in here. I actually don't have that on my study notes, but it just occurs to me now as I'm writing and I've got the story next to me, I'm actually going to put that quote in. He scraped the point lightly. Gross. Okay, so I think that backs up what I'm trying to say. And now I've got to get to the story. So with this theatre of the Gothic done, all right, now I just want to explain what I've done there. So it's clear he's trying to frighten her here, which is why I've used the theatre of the Gothic performed. He's performing something terrifying. But you'll notice that in my essay, what I really want to do is to talk about the relationship of real life to fiction. So in real life, he's hurt himself with the plate, but then he turns to a story, right? So now I can use the quotation where he says, "Do you want me to tell you a story?" All right, and now what I have to do is get to Nita's story. I'm stealing this one, fright and confusion, just so the marker doesn't know I'm not making it up. Now I get to Nita's story. Okay, so now I've got basically the two stories. Okay, I've suggested that they're a character parallel, which means that the stories are now paralleled. I could probably say that, just as the characters are parallel, so now the stories are in parallel. There we go. Can I just say that this little trick here, this just as, so now, is when you're trying to make a comparison, it's actually a really, really effective tool, that one. So feel free to borrow. Okay, so I'm going to add to this just to make sure that everyone knows what I'm talking about. So Nita offers a story equal to the invaders, that needs a comma there, deliberately blurring the line between a literary world and the material world, i.e. she's making one up. Quid pro quo, as in swapsies. There we go. So this basically suggests that one story cancels out the other. Okay. We could even say that. Nah. Okay, I've said too much. I think we probably need a new paragraph because, as I've said to many of you, as a writer, I'm sort of thinking, I bet my reader is getting a bit tired now, right? So I need to restate my case and then go again. Okay. All right, now I've got to where I really want to get to, which is this idea of metafiction. And we've spoken about that. The cool thing about Monroe, and this was really obvious in our discussion, is that it's effective because she is telling us something just as Nita is a reader, so we are readers. And she's pointing out basically that to be successful, you need a reader who believes you. So I think in that way, that's the coolest thing about the story. And when you're talking about literary worlds, usually the coolest thing about the story is what makes it a literary world. So what we have to do here is we have to draw a link between Nita the reader and us the reader. And that suggests how metafiction works in the story. So why don't we do that? I'm going to use that just as so thing. Now, all of this is over here. Read her books cheerfully, somewhere here. Here it is. I'm going to use that one. That's really easy to use. Okay, I'm going to keep doing it, just to really make my point. Just as Nita had always been this one. I'm going to use this one now, just to really hammer the point home. So you can see the point I'm making here is that when we invest in Monroe's literary world, we become Nita. Okay. Now I'm going to point that out. Going back to the question. Now I have this one in my list, The Magic of Reading. I seriously think she's stolen that from Shakespeare, but anyway. Acknowledge. It'd be good if I could spell, wouldn't it? Okay, so this is where I wanted to get to. So basically Nita is powerful because she's a reader, right? So what I'm trying to get to is this idea of the partnership between the two. Coleridge again. Okay, so this sentence here, when the reader offers the willing suspension of disbelief, it's at that point when he starts to believe her that his malice goes away. So in effect, the story operates as an antioxidant. So powerful as stories, we are left with Nita's words. You remember this bit? She hated to hear it. Okay. All right. So I think I've pretty much proved that the story is operating metafictively and that implicates us in storytelling. So what I have to do now is pretty much conclude. But I'm going to conclude powerfully. I'm not just going to repeat what I've got up here. I'm going to try and suggest what I've done here is actually goes a little bit beyond what I've done up here. So I'm really going to play with the idea of the partnership between the two. All right, now I've spoken to you girls in class about this notion of double vision. So it's pretty much what I've been talking about here, but let me just clean this up in the syntax. All right. Now what I'm going to do to conclude is basically just explain what I've said there. So I've just provided a definition of what double vision means there. So we're both inside the story and aware that we are watching the story at the same moment. Okay, you know what? I'm just going to use this last quote here, this one, to tie this up. I could write my own sentence, but you know, where you can use Monroe, do. I'm going to finish just like that. Okay, and if I have a look, that is about, I reckon, there we go, 1,000 words, which is about the length, really, of an extension essay. So there you go. That's how you put it together.